If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, today we have Sonia interviewing John about textual criticism. This is the field of study through which we can know the original text of the New Testament. We are continuing from the previous episode today.
The only begotten God is actually in only 0.1% of the manuscripts. There's no reason to go with that. There's no theological problem with only begotten Son, because Jesus is not begotten as God, but he is begotten as man. There's a point in time at which he added to his deity human body and human nature and became flesh and dwelt among us. So as Son, he's begotten. Only begotten Son is a reference to his incarnation. So that reading has no problem at all. But if you go with the critical text on this, you have a huge problem. In fact, it gets worse, because of those 0.4 that have theos, God, there instead of huios, Son, 3/4 of them read an only begotten God.
Is that any better?
It becomes more problematic, because then it becomes very Gnostic in its teachings. Gnosticism was a mystery religion from the early centuries. It wasn't around as early as Christianity, but it came about probably the late part of the first century or the second century. It was very much like the New Age movement here. Salvation was attained by coming into understanding of certain secret knowledge, or gnosis, which is why it's called Gnosticism. And through this knowledge, you will come to attain to your deity, the realization of your godhood, and all kinds of weird stuff. We're not going to go into a lot of details about Gnosticism now, but here's the point. One of the things they said or taught was that the God of the Old Testament was a false god, an evil, inferior, false god, a demiurgos, and he was teaching lies to people. And with Christianity, or what they called Christianity, what happened was a previously unknown good God showed up to tell us the truth about these, and to tell us that the God of the Old Testament is fake. So when you say an only begotten God, you're indicating, first of all, that there's more than one God, that there's multiple gods. So when you have an only begotten God who is explaining or making the truth known, well, you kind of a tie-in with Gnosticism, where you have a previously unknown God showing up and telling the truth. So this is very problematic, this reading in John 1:18. For sure, certainly the reading that you have in the critical text, the Nessean text, cannot be correct. So it's definitely a problematic, very problematic reading. It's just not possible, and there's no reason that we should choose only begotten God over only begotten Son.
Are there other theological problems?
Yes, there are changes in the critical text that actually eliminate some of the key proof texts for the deity of Christ. Now they will say, oh, it really doesn't matter because there are other proof texts in there. And there are, but it doesn't mean we want to lose. I think every one of them is key, and some of them are very, very good, and yet they are lost in the critical text. If we look, for example, at 1 Timothy 3:16, we read this: "And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up in glory." So who is being talked about here?
Jesus.
Obviously Jesus. It's very clear. Okay? Without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh. So it's talking about Jesus, and it explicitly calls him God. So here's smoking gun proof that Jesus is, in fact, God. However, if we look at the critical text the one produced by mainstream textual criticism, the Nestle-Aland text, we read, "And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness, who was manifested in the flesh." You see a problem here?
Well, there's no more reference to Jesus being God.
Exactly. We've lost that important point. They will go with a reading that appears at most in 9 manuscripts. And most in 9 manuscripts. And they will go, instead of God was manifested in the flesh, to who was manifested in the flesh. And not only does this appear only in a very, very few manuscripts, the other problem is that the reading they go with makes no sense. Grammatically, it doesn't make any sense at all, because who is a relative pronoun?
Although that on its own may not be a problem. Okay, they weren't Greek texts, but I remember reading a number of Latin texts where there'd be a narrative, and oftentimes the next sentence would begin with a relative pronoun, which was called a connecting relative pronoun. It wasn't proper to translate it as a relative pronoun in English, so we would change that pronoun to he or she or whatever it was, but it was actually pretty common.
Yes, but even there, the first statement had to have the antecedent, didn't it? The relative pronouns would then refer back to the antecedent in the first sentence, wouldn't it?
That's true.
Yeah, so this is the problem here. There's no antecedent. Great is the mystery of godliness, and then it goes into this list of things that happened to this one. So God, well, that's who it was. That's your subject. If you have who, it's not a subject. It's a relative pronoun. It has to have an antecedent. What is the antecedent? There isn't one. Yeah, at most you could try to argue that it's godliness, but that can't be an antecedent for the things that follow. So in this case, you have a reading that loses this proof text for the day of Christ, and it can't be right because it makes no sense grammatically, and yet this is what's chosen in for a critical text. Interestingly enough, the NIV, the NASB, the ESV, the modern translation, these 3 translate this as he was manifested in the flesh. What's significant about that? Well, they have to put he instead of who because they know the grammar makes no sense. So they've changed the who to he, and in doing so, they put into their Bibles a text word that doesn't appear in any Greek manuscript whatsoever. We'd have to call it a conjectural emendation, I suppose, but it really isn't. So what they're doing is putting something that no manuscript has. So they kind of realize that the reading in the text they're using cannot be. It cannot be. So they're actually doing what they accuse the scribes of doing, which is they're altering the text to fix a perceived mistake. And there's no justification for doing that, and there's no need for doing that. The text clearly says God was manifested in the flesh.
Well, is that relative pronoun at least masculine and singular?
It is masculine and singular, and let me tell you how I think it came about. It has to do with what's called nomina sacra. Scribes used to have shorthand forms when they're copying, because copying by hand is a very laborious and time-consuming task. So they created shorthand forms for certain significant words, holy words, nomina sacra, holy names. And the short form would be to take the first letter and take the last letter. And sometimes you'd have to have the last letter and the second last letter to show the case, but that's what you would do. And you would draw a bar over the top to show that this is a short form. So theos for the Greek is the Greek word for God. So if you're going to do a nomina sacra for this, as they did, or nominum sacrum, what would it be?
Well, you said the...
First and last.
Okay, so then you have to have a theta and a sigma. Oh, and I suppose a messy theta could look like an omicron, which would look like the form of the relative pronoun.
Exactly. The first letter is a theta, the second is a sigma. That would be the nominum sacrum for theos, for God. But it looks exactly like hos, the relative pronoun for who, except that there's the line across the middle of the theta. So if for some reason that got rubbed out or obscured, that middle line, perhaps it was on a fold in the parchment, Or perhaps the scribe wasn't looking very carefully. He might just write down an omicron sigma, and you've got your relative pronoun instead of theos. So that's probably how it came about in this case. But again, that would get into very few manuscripts only, and that's what happened. And they should have caught it right away because grammatically it makes no sense. Now, here's another example of a proof text for the deity of Christ that is taken out, that disappears in the critical text. It's disappeared, so to speak. And this comes from Acts chapter 20, 28. This is where Paul is giving his farewell address to the Ephesian elders and giving them warnings. In Acts 20, 28, he says to them, "Therefore, take heed to yourselves and to all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood." Now, isn't that interesting? It's the church of God, the church that God purchased with his own blood. How did God purchase the church with his own blood?
Well, Christ's blood, and Christ is God. So, yeah, this verse showing that God and Christ are one.
Yeah, so as God, God has no blood. But as the man Jesus Christ, who is God in the flesh, he has blood. And it was his sacrifice on the cross that purchased the church. It makes perfect sense, right? And so it's another proof text from the Bible, another clear, explicit indication that Jesus is deity. But if you will look at the critical text, it doesn't read the church of God which he purchased with his own blood. It reads, to shepherd the church of God which he purchased with the blood of his own. Do you see the difference there?
Well, yeah, so it still looks like, yeah, purchased with Jesus' blood, his own son, but it's not showing that Jesus is God anymore.
Yeah, exactly. That proof text for the deity of Christ is disappeared by the critical text. Now, this reading that you see in the critical text occurs in, once again, a very small minority of manuscripts. We've looked at the mathematics. You cannot have a secondary reading infect a large majority of manuscripts, but that's, here you have 95% of manuscripts read the church of God which he purchased with his own blood, a proof text for the deity of Christ. A very small fraction, 5%, have to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with the blood of his own, which does not indicate the deity of Christ, which is in a small number of manuscripts, and it's the one chosen by the critical text. And interestingly enough, though, if you look at the NIV or the ESV or the NASB, in this verse, they actually follow the majority text reading. They will say the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. Now, that's interesting. Why do they do that? They, based on the text they use for translating the entire New Testament, they believe the critical text is the accurate one. Why do they deviate from that here on this verse and go with the majority text? I can't see any reason why they ignore the text that they would follow everywhere else as the best text, but they do.
Yeah, especially when they mess up other verses by following the critical text, and then it seems sort of, yeah, random, as if they missed it somehow.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.